There's a specific type of empath a narcissist learns to fear more than any other, and it isn't because she's cold, aggressive, or skilled at confrontation. It's almost the opposite. She's warmer than most people they encounter, more perceptive, more genuinely caring, and somehow, despite all of that warmth, completely structurally unmanipulable in a way that makes her the single most dangerous person a narcissist can ever let close. This is the super empath, and today we're going to walk through exactly what separates her from every other empath a narcissist has successfully targeted before, and why her particular combination of traits functions as something close to psychological kryptonite for a manipulation style built to work on almost everyone else. Let's start by understanding why the term super empath actually describes something distinct, rather than simply being a more flattering label for an ordinary empath. Most empaths share a genuine capacity for deep feeling, strong intuition, and real compassion for the people around them. These are wonderful, valuable traits, and they're not what distinguishes a super empath from anyone else. What distinguishes her is a second, entirely separate capacity, one that doesn't naturally accompany empathy and often has to be built through difficult, deliberate experience. An equally strong, equally consistent sense of her own boundaries and self-worth, operating alongside her empathy rather than being overridden by it. This distinction matters enormously because it explains something that confuses a lot of people trying to understand why some deeply empathetic people get repeatedly targeted and worn down by narcissists, while others, seemingly just as empathetic, prove almost completely resistant to the same tactics. The difference was never actually about the depth of empathy itself. Both types of people feel deeply, care genuinely, and extend real compassion to the people in their lives. The difference lives entirely in what happens after the empathy is activated, whether it flows without limit, absorbing whatever's directed at it regardless of cost, or whether it flows through a structure sturdy enough to filter what deserves it from what doesn't, protecting the person offering it from being drained past what's sustainable or healthy. Here's why this combination is so specifically threatening to a narcissist's entire operating strategy. And it's worth understanding the mechanism in depth because it explains every subsequent pattern we'll discuss today. A narcissist's manipulation toolkit isn't actually built to overcome resistance directly. It's built to exploit specific vulnerabilities, and it works by locating whichever vulnerability happens to be present and applying pressure exactly there. An ordinary target's empathy, unprotected by strong boundaries, functions as exactly the kind of vulnerability this toolkit is designed to exploit. Guilt lands because the empathetic instinct to avoid causing someone else pain overrides the person's own needs. Love bombing works because deep emotional capacity, unfiltered by discernment about whether it's actually warranted yet, gets activated too quickly and too completely by intense early attention. Gaslighting succeeds because self-doubt, common in people whose empathy makes them naturally inclined to consider they might be misreading a situation, isn't balanced by an equally strong trust in their own direct perception. A super empath's boundaries don't eliminate her empathy. This is worth stating clearly because it's a common misunderstanding. She still feels everything an ordinary empath feels, the same depth of compassion, the same intuitive read on other people's emotional states, the same genuine capacity for care. What's different is that none of these capacities operate without a filter anymore. Her guilt gets checked against an actual assessment of whether she's done anything that genuinely warrants it, rather than being triggered automatically by someone else's disappointment or distress. Her emotional responsiveness to intense early attention gets tempered by an awareness that intensity and genuine intimacy are different things, developed through actual time and demonstrated trustworthiness, rather than through the sheer force of how big the feelings feel in the moment. Her willingness to consider she might be misreading a situation coexists with a stable trust in her own direct experience, meaning she can remain genuinely open to being wrong without collapsing into automatic self-doubt every time someone confidently insists she's wrong. This combination removes every point of leverage a narcissist's toolkit depends on to function, and it's worth understanding exactly how disorienting this is for someone who's built their entire relational strategy around locating and exploiting exactly these kinds of vulnerabilities. Imagine for a moment an entire skill set refined over years, tested successfully against dozens of different people, built around a fairly reliable assumption that empathy and boundary weakness travel together, that deep feeling and easy manipulation are, in practice, nearly the same thing. A super empath disproves this assumption completely, not through argument, not through confrontation, but simply through the plain fact of her own existence, someone who feels everything just as deeply as every previous target, while remaining completely structurally resistant to every tool that's ever worked before. Here's what makes her specifically the narcissist's worst enemy, rather than simply another difficult person to manipulate. It isn't just that she resists successfully, it's that her resistance is genuinely instructive, in a way a narcissist finds almost unbearable to sit with, because it demonstrates something their entire worldview depends on denying: that the previous targets who did get manipulated weren't simply weak, foolish, or somehow deserving of what happened to them. They were missing a specific learnable capacity that the super empath happens to possess, which means the manipulation was never actually a reflection of the narcissist's exceptional skill or irresistible charm, as their self-concept desperately needs to believe. It was always contingent on a specific vulnerability being present in the target, a vulnerability that simply isn't universal, isn't inevitable, and isn't actually connected to depth of feeling the way the narcissist has always assumed. This realization, even when it never fully surfaces into conscious, articulate thought, produces a specific kind of discomfort that's worth understanding in detail, because it explains the particular intensity with which narcissists often respond to encountering a super empath, an intensity that frequently seems disproportionate to whatever's actually happening in the relationship at any given moment. Ordinary rejection, even painful rejection, doesn't typically threaten a narcissist's fundamental operating assumptions about how relationships and manipulation work. It simply represents one failed attempt among what's usually been a fairly successful overall track record. A super empath's resistance is different because it doesn't just represent a single failure. It represents evidence against the entire framework the narcissist has used to understand and navigate every relationship in their adult life. Evidence that's difficult to dismiss as an isolated anomaly, precisely because her resistance holds consistently across every tactic throughout the entire duration of contact, rather than eventually giving way the way ordinary resistance usually does under sufficient sustained pressure. This brings us to something worth understanding in detail: what actually happens behaviorally once a narcissist recognizes, usually not consciously at first, but through the accumulating evidence of repeated tactical failure, that he's encountered someone who fits this specific profile. Because the response tends to follow a fairly predictable arc, and understanding it in advance protects you enormously if you recognize yourself as this type of empath, currently navigating a relationship with someone exhibiting these patterns. The initial phase, often the longest and most intense, is escalating fascination rather than immediate retreat. And this surprises a lot of people who assume a narcissist would simply move on quickly once his usual tactics fail to produce results. What actually tends to happen is closer to the opposite, at least initially. A super empath's combination of warmth and unshakable boundaries doesn't read, to a narcissist encountering it for the first time, as a closed door. It often reads as a uniquely compelling challenge, someone who offers all the genuine emotional depth and connection he's always sought, paired with a resistance that his considerable skill has never previously failed to eventually overcome. This combination can trigger an intensification of pursuit rather than a retreat, because the narcissist's confidence in his own tactical abilities hasn't yet been sufficiently challenged to produce genuine doubt about whether this particular target might actually be different. This is worth understanding clearly if you're currently experiencing this exact dynamic, because the intensity of early pursuit from a narcissist who's identified you as a super empath can feel, especially before you fully understand what's happening, remarkably similar to genuine, deep interest, which, in a strange way, it actually is, even though the interest is functioning very differently than it would in a healthy relationship. He genuinely is fascinated, genuinely is drawn toward the specific combination you represent. What he isn't equipped to do, even while genuinely fascinated, is actually sustain a relationship with someone who requires the kind of consistent, accountable behavior a super empath's boundaries actually demand, rather than simply the performance of good behavior that's usually sufficient to satisfy less boundaried partners during the relationship's opening months. The second phase begins once the initial fascination starts running into the reality of what maintaining this relationship actually requires: sustained accountability, consistent follow through on stated commitments, genuine respect for boundaries that don't move regardless of how charmingly or persistently they're tested. This is where the escalating tactics we've discussed in earlier videos begin in earnest. Increased pressure, more sophisticated emotional appeals, triangulation, and eventually, often, a kind of visible destabilization as tactic after tactic fails to produce the expected softening. What's worth adding here, specifically in the context of the super empath dynamic, is how this destabilization tends to be more intense and more prolonged than it would be with an ordinary target, precisely because the initial fascination created a deeper investment than usual, which means the eventual failure of every available tactic represents a correspondingly larger threat to the narcissist's self-concept than a more ordinary, lower investment rejection would. Here's what's genuinely worth understanding about the super empath's experience during this entire escalating sequence, because it explains something that can feel confusing from the inside if you're currently living through it. Holding these boundaries consistently, even when it's clearly the right thing to do, and even when it's clearly working exactly as it should, is genuinely exhausting in a way that's easy to interpret as evidence that something's going wrong. It isn't. The exhaustion isn't a sign that your boundaries are failing or that you're somehow doing this incorrectly. It's simply what it actually costs in real time to remain the one stable, unmoving point in a dynamic that's actively, persistently trying to locate some way to destabilize you. This cost is real, even when the boundaries themselves are holding perfectly, and it's worth acknowledging honestly rather than expecting yourself to feel effortlessly calm and unaffected throughout the entire process. This is also where something important and often unaddressed becomes relevant. A super empath's boundaries protect her from being successfully manipulated, but they don't protect her from the genuine grief of watching someone she cares about prove incapable of the accountability a real relationship with her actually requires. This distinction matters because it's easy to assume that successfully resisting manipulation should feel like straightforward victory, uncomplicated by loss. In practice, it often doesn't. You can hold every boundary perfectly, remain completely unmanipulated throughout the entire relationship, and still experience real, legitimate grief when it becomes clear that the person you cared about was never actually capable of meeting you as an equal, accountable partner, no matter how much genuine warmth and connection existed alongside the manipulation attempts. The third phase, once the narcissist's tactics have been thoroughly, repeatedly exhausted without producing the expected result, tends to diverge in one of two directions, both of which we've discussed in earlier videos in different contexts, but are worth revisiting specifically in relation to the super empath dynamic. The more common outcome is withdrawal and redirection, a gradual shift of attention toward a new target who hasn't yet demonstrated this particular kind of resistance, accompanied by exactly the narrative reconstruction we've discussed before, recasting the super empath's unshakable boundaries as coldness, unreasonableness, or an inability to appreciate genuine effort, because that story is far more survivable for the narcissist's self-concept than the alternative explanation underneath it. The less common but genuinely significant outcome involves something closer to actual, if often incomplete, reckoning, a narcissist who, having encountered someone whose resistance never wavered despite every tool available being deployed against it, experiences a kind of forced confrontation with the specific evidence a super empath represents. Proof that manipulation was never actually inevitable, that some people simply cannot be manipulated regardless of skill or persistence, and that the difference lies not in something inherently wrong with previous, more easily manipulated partners, but in a specific learnable capacity the super empath happens to possess and previous partners, through no particular fault of their own, didn't yet have access to. This recognition, when it occurs at all, doesn't guarantee lasting change. We've discussed at length in earlier videos why genuine transformation remains relatively rare even when significant catalysts for it are present. But it does represent something meaningfully different from the more common outcome, and it's worth understanding as a real, if uncommon, possibility, rather than something that never occurs at all. Now let's bring this together into what actually matters most, because everything we've discussed today, the mechanism behind why a super empath's combination of traits is so uniquely resistant to manipulation, the specific escalating arc a narcissist typically moves through when he encounters her, and the two outcomes that eventually follow once his tactics have been thoroughly exhausted, has been, in a sense, describing this dynamic from his side of the story. It's worth understanding clearly, but it was never actually the point of becoming this kind of empath in the first place. And closing this discussion by returning fully to your side of it matters enormously. Here's the first thing worth understanding clearly. If you recognize yourself as a super empath, someone whose boundaries have consistently held against manipulation that's worked reliably on other people, I want you to understand what that combination actually represents, because it's easy, especially if you're currently in the middle of the exhausting third phase we just described, to lose sight of how genuinely rare and valuable this combination actually is. You didn't arrive at this by accident, and you almost certainly didn't arrive at it without cost. The empathy that makes you capable of genuine, deep compassion, even for people who've hurt you, combined with boundaries stable enough that this compassion never once overrides your own sense of what you deserve. This pairing typically gets built through exactly the kind of difficult experience that teaches someone, often painfully, precisely where the line between generosity and self-abandonment actually sits. Here's the second thing worth understanding, and it's the reframe that matters most as we close out this entire discussion. Being a narcissist's worst enemy was never actually your purpose, even though understanding that you function that way can offer real validating clarity, especially after navigating the exhausting escalation we've described today. You didn't build unshakable boundaries in order to become uniquely threatening to narcissists specifically. You built them because you deserved a version of yourself, capable of loving deeply without that depth ever again costing you your own well-being, your own dignity, or your own sense of what you're actually worth, independent of anyone else's approval. The fact that this particular combination happens to be exactly what a narcissist's entire manipulation strategy has no answer for is a genuine, real consequence of who you've become. But it was always a byproduct, never the actual goal. This distinction matters enormously for how you carry this identity forward, because if narcissist's worst enemy becomes something you're actively performing or measuring yourself against, tracking how successfully you're resisting, treating every interaction as a contest to be won rather than simply living according to a clear, stable sense of your own worth, you risk reintroducing exactly the kind of external orientation that makes boundaries fragile in the first place. The version of this identity that actually holds, that actually protects you consistently rather than requiring constant vigilant defense, is the version where your boundaries simply are what they are, quietly and consistently, regardless of whether anyone testing them ever notices, understands, or responds to them in any particular way. If you're currently in the exhausting third phase we described earlier, watching a narcissist's escalating attempts fail against boundaries you know are correct, while still carrying real, legitimate grief for what this relationship could have been if the person on the other side had been capable of meeting you as an actual equal, I want you to understand that both of these experiences can be true simultaneously without contradiction. You can hold your boundaries perfectly, remain completely resistant to every manipulation tactic thrown at you, and still feel genuine sadness about what didn't work out, without that sadness meaning anything has gone wrong with how you've handled this. Grief and correct boundaries aren't opposites. They frequently coexist, especially for someone whose empathy remains fully intact even while her self-worth stays completely unshakable. And if you're not yet fully this person, if you recognize the description of the super empath as something you're working toward rather than something you've already fully become, still finding certain tactics land more effectively against you than you'd like, still noticing moments where your empathy occasionally overrides boundaries you know intellectually should hold firm. Understand that this isn't evidence of some permanent deficiency separating you from the empaths who've already built this capacity. Every quality we've discussed today is buildable through exactly the kind of deliberate, sometimes painful practice we've discussed throughout this entire series. Noticing when guilt arrives without genuine justification, checking your own perception against direct experience rather than automatically deferring to someone else's confident insistence, tolerating someone's disappointment without immediately needing to fix it, holding boundaries as simple statements of fact rather than positions requiring extensive defense. The super empath isn't a narcissist's worst enemy because she was born with some special immunity the rest of us weren't given. She's his worst enemy because she did the hard, patient work of building a self that doesn't require his approval, his consistency, or his eventual capacity for accountability in order to remain whole. That work is available to anyone willing to do it, regardless of how far away it might currently feel, and it was never actually built as a weapon against anyone. It was built simply and completely for her. The fact that it happens to be the one thing a narcissist can never successfully manipulate was always just what happened to be true once she finally, fully belonged to herself.